like that response. Good evening.
Good evening.
Very good. Very glad to have you here tonight. This is a special evening to have Roberto Goizueta come talk to us. And it's a bit of a homecoming because 31 years ago, the Aquinas Center of Theology began at Emory, and one of its first officers was Roberto Goizueta. And as I said at lunch today, I've looked at the old pictures, and he was kind of sporting a bad 70s cop mustache, and he now looks very distinguished. So he's come a long way. But he's also done a lot of things in his life. So I'm going to give you just a little background on his bio so you have some sense of what he's done and what he's accomplished. He's from Atlanta, right? And we both share that. He went to Yale University for his undergraduate in philosophy? Political science, that's right, you said that. Political science, then he went to Marquette for his master's and his doctorate. He then came here, did you come immediately to the Aquinas Center?
No, I was at Loyola New Orleans.
Okay, Loyola New Orleans, then here. And then you went to Loyola Chicago, and then on to Boston College, where he's the Margaret Flatley, now emeritus professor. He just retired after more than 20 years. Theoretically, right? Theoretically retired after more than 20 distinguished years there. They just had a big celebration of his work. He's written over more than 100 articles and book chapters and things of this nature. He is known as one of the top Catholic theologians in the country. He's held all sorts of positions in the Catholic Theological Association. So he has a very distinguished career. I think you get the gist of that, and we're very fortunate to have him here. He's also going to be coming back here to Candler to teach us for a semester in the spring of 2020. So we'll look forward, for those of you who will be here, look forward to that. You'll have an opportunity to actually see a good deal more of him. He spoke at lunch today about migration, and tonight he's going to turn toward the preferential option for the poor. And that's one of those terms we hear a lot about, but I'm not sure how much we know specifically what that means and why that's important for us to study as Catholics, and I would say also beyond the Catholic Church as well. So we look forward to hearing more about that and hearing his talk, and then afterwards we'll have some time for questions and answers, and then after that maybe a little time if you'd just like to come down and chat for a second, and then we have to let him get some rest because he's flying out tomorrow back to Boston. Cold Boston. So that's why you need to come down here. It's warm, as you recall. So anyway, Roberto, please.
Thank you so much, Phil. Thanks so much for inviting me. It is a homecoming, and I'm delighted always to come back to Emory and to Candler and to the Aquinas Center and to see all the amazing work that the Aquinas Center is doing here at Emory and at Candler. Today, this evening, what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about the preferential option for the poor, which, as Phil said, is a term that I think gets bandied about a lot, especially these days with Pope Francis, but which I don't think we necessarily understand the real significance often of it and the centrality of the preferential option for the poor for Christian faith. So that's what I'll try to do is to talk a little bit about the preferential option for the poor, which I see as intrinsic to Christian faith, as in some ways as simply a logical corollary of what it means to be a Christian. A couple of years ago, the Catholic Church celebrated the 50th anniversary of that historic ecclesial event, Vatican II. At the very heart of Vatican II was the call for the Church to become a church of the poor. On September 11th, 1962, for instance, on the eve of the Second Vatican Council, Pope John XXIII taped a radio message addressed to, quote, all the Christian faithful and broadcast around the world. In that address, the Holy Father set the tone for the Council by declaring that, quote, confronted with the underdeveloped countries, the Church presents itself as it is and wishes to be, the church of all, and particularly the church of the poor, unquote. At the council's adjournment 3 years later, Pope Paul VI joined the council fathers in addressing a message to all the, quote, poor, the sick, and suffering of the world. And I quote from Paul VI's message. All of you who feel heavily the weight of the cross, you who are poor and abandoned, you who weep, you who are persecuted for justice, you who are ignored, you the unknown victims of suffering, take courage. You are the preferred children of the kingdom of God, the kingdom of hope, happiness, and life. You are the brothers of the suffering Christ, and with him, if you wish, you are saving the world. This is the Christian science of suffering, the only one which gives peace. Know that you are not alone, separated, abandoned, or useless. You have been called by Christ and are his living and transparent image. In his name, the council salutes you lovingly, thanks you, assures you of the friendship and assistance of the church, and blesses you, unquote. At the very heart of the Second Vatican Council's deliberations, which notably included episcopal voices from throughout the Third World, was the Church's attempt to retrieve the gospel as good news for the poor in the contemporary context of the world church. Yet the poor, the sick, and the suffering addressed here are no mere objects of Christian charity or even Christian justice. They are Christ's, quote, living and transparent image, unquote. The poor, the sick, and suffering are not only the evangelized, they are the evangelizers, the ones with and through whom Jesus Christ is saving the world. Thus, the Second Vatican Council planted the seeds of what in later Catholic social teaching would come to be known as the preferential option for the poor. Perhaps more than any recent pontiff, Pope Francis has focused his papacy on this call for Christians to make a preferential option for the poor. Pope Francis's consistent call for a culture of encounter reminds us that in the encounter with the poor person, with the stranger, we encounter Christ himself. Thus, we're called to accompany the poor not just as an ethical imperative in order to be good Christians, but as a condition of our own salvation and liberation in order to be Christians at all. It is in this sense that Pope Paul VI could claim that with Christ, the poor themselves are saving the world. Our own salvation is dependent upon our openness to the poor. Their liberation is the precondition for our liberation and our salvation. Conversely, fear of the poor or the stranger is the most fundamental obstacle to our own salvation, and thus the most fundamental mortal sin in the literal sense of that term. The preferential option for the poor is one of the most influential theological concepts of the last 50 years, and one of the most misunderstood, I would argue. No sooner is the term mentioned than it is met with the rejoinder, but what about the rich? Aren't we supposed to love them as well? Or why are the poor necessarily any better than the rich? Surely there are plenty of bad poor people. Or I thought that Christians were supposed to be about harmony and reconciliation, not partiality and divisiveness. The Peruvian theologian Gustavo Gutierrez, the so-called father of liberation theology, has suggested that the two principal overarching themes in Scripture are first, the universality and gratuity of God's love. God loves everyone equally and without any merit on our part. And secondly, God's preferential love for the poor. At first blush, these appear to be mutually contradictory assertions. How can God love everybody equally and love the poor preferentially? In this paper, I will argue that instead, these are actually two integrally related, mutually implicit principles, i.e. that you can't have one without the other. I will suggest further that the possibility of making such an option is impeded not so much by our fear of or hatred of the poor as by our fundamental fear of and hatred of ourselves. Self-hatred is the root of all hatred. I want to first insist that God's preferential love for the poor is the guarantee or safeguard of God's transcendence, sovereignty, and mystery. If God is truly other, with a capital O, and thus irreducible to any merely human concept or construction, then logically God will take the side of the poor, the marginalized, the outcast, the victims. What at first glance appear to be mutually contradictory assertions are in fact mutually implicit. This conclusion can only be reached, however, if one first acknowledges that the poor exist, that there are indeed human beings who exist on the margins of our society and world who are all but invisible to the rest of us, despite the fact that the poor constitute 2/3 of the human family. The Jesuit theologian John Sobrino defines the poor as, quote, those persons who cannot take life for granted, unquote. Tragically, we live in a divided world and society, and the persons in the best position to perceive that division, to recognize it, are those who suffer its consequences. They're the ones whose very existence reminds us of the uncomfortable and inconvenient truth that we live in an unjust world. The small minority of us who benefit from social divisions are likely to either ignore these or de-emphasize their significance. It's the hungry person who is in the best position to determine whether hunger exists in our society. In Sobrino's terms, the person who cannot take life for granted is in the best position to be honest about reality, what he calls honesty about reality. In other words, the poor or powerless have a privileged perspective from which to evaluate what we call reality. Note, however, that such privilege in no way assumes infallibility or inevitability, only a greater likelihood of accuracy. Thus, it's the black person who is in a better position to determine whether, in fact, all lives do indeed matter, since unless and until black lives matter, we cannot credibly claim that all lives matter. If we do indeed live in a divided world in which the victims of this division keep us honest about reality, then what is the theological significance of this fact? More specifically, what can it mean to say that God enters into and becomes incarnate in a world beset by divisions between those who have power and can take life for granted and those who are powerless and cannot take life for granted? In such a world, what would it mean to say that God loves all people equally and freely? For over 2,000 years, the Christian tradition has proposed an answer that for many has seemed inconceivable, if not scandalous. In such a divided world, the perfect expression of God's love is found in the utter powerlessness of a condemned criminal who, having experienced abandonment by his closest friends and even by God, hangs pitiably from a wooden cross. God's love enters history in the person of an outcast who is tortured and crucified for befriending other outcasts. God's love enters a divided society on the side of those who suffer the consequences of that division, not because God loves the outcast more, but because in the midst of division and conflict, God's love for the victims and God's love for their victimizers must take different forms. Indeed, God's love for the powerful may not first be experienced as love at all, since it will take the form of challenge, confrontation, and a call to conversion. To say that God's love is universal, then, is not to say that it is neutral. In fact, it is to say the very opposite. Precisely because God's love is universal, it cannot be neutral. If I, as a father, enter a room and I have a teenage son and a 6 or 7-year-old daughter, and the big, strong son is beating up on his smaller sister, and I enter that room, I love both of my children equally. What am I going to do? Am I going to stand back and say, I love you both equally, therefore I'm not going to take sides in this? Or do I jump in and, first of all, try to convince my son to get off of his sister, and then eventually jump in and liberate his sister from his clutches? That is, in that situation of division and conflict, my universal love, my equal love for the two has to take different forms. To stand back and say, I love you both equally, therefore I don't take sides in this conflict, is by my inaction and silence to actually side with the oppressor in that situation. So neutrality, like silence, is consent. In a situation of division, a neutral stance is implicit support for the unjust status quo, and therefore implicit support for the persons benefiting from the injustice. In the words of Archbishop Desmond Tutu, if an elephant has its foot on the tail of a mouse and you say that you're neutral, the mouse will not appreciate your neutrality. The crucified and risen Christ is the historical incarnation of this logic, the logic of God's universal gratuitous love. If the incarnate God is truly other, truly mystery, then God will be revealed most fully among those persons who themselves are most other, most incomprehensible in our world. Another way of saying that God is transcendent is to say that God does not belong in this world. And if that's the case, then God will be revealed especially among those persons who themselves do not belong in our society, the outcasts, the excluded, those who are discarded, to use Pope Francis's term. That transcendent God will be found especially among the hungry in a gluttonous world, among the powerless in a power-mad world, among the insecure in a world obsessed with security. In the crucified Christ, God assumes the most degrading, dehumanizing dimensions of victimized human existence by becoming himself the absolute victim. God does this not to privilege victimhood, which is always an evil, but precisely to reveal once and for all the absolutely gratuitous and universal character of God's love for all persons, indeed for all creation. What we revere when we gaze upon the crucifix is not the wooden cross, which is always evil, but the body hanging on it, which is always sacred. The preferential option for the poor is not an option for the cross, but for the crucified. In the remainder of this paper, I will propose that a fundamental obstacle to our appreciation of God's preferential love for the poor is what the social psychologist Ernest Becker once called the denial of death. To help make this argument, I want to begin with two short anecdotes. First is an anecdote of something that happened to me when I was a college student at Yale in New Haven. Those of you who have been to New Haven know that the campus is surrounded by a good deal of poverty, and there are homeless people who walk around and through the campus regularly. And while I was a student there, I would normally give whatever change I had in my pocket to homeless people I would come across. And this particular evening, I came across a bedraggled old homeless man, and I reached inside my pocket as I usually did, and handed him some coins. And he, as I gave him the coins, he reached up and was going for my head. And I immediately froze and paralyzed and thought, oh my God, I'm going to be mugged. And as I was thinking that, he reaches, grabs my head, plants a kiss on my forehead, and says, thank you. I was stunned. A lot of things was going through my head and my heart at that time. I walked away, totally paralyzed. And then by the time I had come to my senses and realized what had just happened, I was like a few blocks away. I decided I have to go back and thank him for what he had just done for me. And unfortunately, by the time I'd gotten back, he had already left. I never found him again. I was never able to see him again and thank him for what he had done for me. So that experience really made me confront, in a very profound way, my own fears, my own prejudices, and how those really misrepresented what was really going on in that encounter. The second anecdote I want to talk about is something that happened to me, a conversation I had when I was in Chicago, when I was at Loyola, teaching at Loyola in Chicago, and we had a friend who was a nurse at Cook County Hospital, which is the big public hospital. It's like Grady here in Atlanta, in Chicago, and she was a nurse in the emergency room for a number of years. And I was talking with her, and she said that she was leaving her job because she had just gotten burned out working in the emergency room, constantly having to deal with taking bullets out of young African-American Latino men's bodies. She said it was just devastating and she couldn't take it anymore. So she had taken a new job at a suburban hospital outside Chicago. A couple years later, I run into her again and I ask her, well, now that you're at the suburban hospital, I think it was in Winnetka, how's it going? And she said, well, not so good. She says, I'm still taking bullets out of young men's bodies, but now they're white young men with self-inflicted wounds. And so I thought about that then, and I continue to think about that now. And so that challenged me to ask the question, is there a connection? Are these simply two disconnected realities, the reality of inner city gang violence and the reality of suburban suicides? The highest rates of suicide are among young white males in the suburbs. And so that's what I want to reflect on a little right now. You might ask what these two stories, seemingly so different, have in common. Rather than ask such an abstract question, however, what I'd like to do is ask the more personal question, which is, what did I learn from them? So let me share some reflections. An important lesson I learned from these experiences is that I crave security. I don't like to feel like I'm not in control of my own life. I want to make sure that my life is all planned out and that nothing happens that I haven't foreseen. What makes me happy at the end of each day is the feeling that I've accomplished everything I set out to do that day and that nothing unexpected interrupted my plans, that I checked all the boxes. Indeed, we all want to know where we'll be 5, 10, 20 years from now, and we want to have control of our future, where we'll live, what job we'll have, who we'll marry, how many kids we'll have, when we'll retire, et cetera, et cetera. One of the most common questions in any job interview is, what's your 5-year plan? This is especially true in our U.S. culture, where we're taught from the time we're small kids that if we only strive and work hard enough, we can be in complete control of our lives and our futures. Happiness means having a large enough bank account or an impressive enough resume so that we never have to know what it's like to be insecure, to be vulnerable, to be powerless. Yet the fact of the matter is that to be a human being, to be alive, is to exist in a situation of inherent insecurity, vulnerability, and uncertainty. Regardless of how much money we have, where we go to college, how prestigious our job is, how many guns we have, or how high the walls around us are, we do not know and cannot know for sure what tomorrow holds. Our lives and futures are always beyond our complete control. In Sobrino's terms, none of us can take life for granted, ultimately. But we try to avoid this painful, inescapable reality at all costs. One way we do this is by avoiding those people in our communities who themselves live in situations of vulnerability and insecurity. We feel threatened by them because they remind us of what we'd rather forget, namely that ultimately we're all in the same boat. None of us is in complete control. None of us knows for sure what the future holds. The only thing we know for sure is that when we come to the end of our lives, we'll all wind up in the same place. The powerless, vulnerable persons in our midst force us to be honest about that reality. In the broken countenance of the poor person, we inevitably see reflected our own fundamental brokenness, which we strive so mightily to repress. We thus erect all sorts of walls and barriers, both visible and invisible, to shield us from the most vulnerable people of our societies, the poor, the sick, the elderly, the homeless, the stranger, the prisoner, the undocumented. We avoid the poor not because we're afraid of them, but because we're afraid of ourselves. We're afraid that we may not be as invulnerable as we think we are. So we put the poor out of sight, on the other side of the tracks or the other side of the border, where we'll never have to come across them. We put them anywhere but in our supposedly secure, peaceful neighborhoods. At its very core, however, the Christian story represents a fundamental rejection of this dynamic of fear, exclusion, and violence. After Jesus' crucifixion, his disciples themselves sought the illusory security of four walls, secluding themselves in the upper room out of fear for their lives. But into that room erupts unexpectedly the resurrected victim, who invites them to look at his wounds. They must have been terrified of those wounds, the wounds on the body of the victim whom they themselves had helped crucify by abandoning him on the way to Calvary. No wonder the disciples were frightened. Indeed, they must have been scared to death at the sight of the man they had just betrayed, who was now confronting them with the very visible, concrete signs of that betrayal, those irksome, inconvenient wounds. The disciples had probably assumed that, now that Jesus was dead, they could put the past behind them, chalk it up to a misguided idealism, and go on to live the contented lives of good, upstanding fishermen, tax collectors, etc. However, in walks Jesus unexpectedly to remind them of that troubling past, to prick consciences that had just begun to find some equilibrium, however tenuous. In the upper room, Jesus reveals to the disciples not only who he is, but also who they are. And he does this by sticking his wounds in their faces. He doesn't say, let bygones be bygones or forgive and forget. Instead, he refuses to allow his disciples to forget what they had done to him. Jesus forces them to confront the painful consequences of their abandonment and betrayal. Look and see. Put your hand here. Do not forget what you've done to me. Yet Jesus does this not to condemn his friends, which must surely be what they had expected, but to forgive them, to extend an unexpected mercy to them, to liberate them from their fears and anxieties. As he shows them his wounds, he says to them, peace be with you, and sits down to break bread with them. He forgives by not forgetting. The glorified body of the resurrected Jesus still bears his wounds and always will. Jesus' resurrection can only be experienced by those who first acknowledge those wounds. Conversely, if Easter is not perceived from the perspective of Good Friday, the celebration of Easter will function simply as a denial of the reality of Good Friday. The fact that all lives matter is only credible when preceded by an acknowledgement that Black lives matter, or Latino lives, or immigrant lives, or prison inmates' lives, etc. Otherwise, the assertion that all lives matter functions simply as a denial of injustice, Easter as a denial of Good Friday. It's only when the disciples are confronted by the innocent victim who unexpectedly erupts into their secure world that they're forced to confront their own fears and are thus liberated from those fears. It's only then that Thomas has the courage to proclaim, my Lord and my God. The refusal to face the wounds that appear on Christ's resurrected body and on the bodies of all the victims of history is the mortal sin, in the most literal sense of that term, for it leads inevitably to the deaths of others and indeed to our own interior death. The murderous consequences of this denial of death, as Ernest Becker refers to it, in contemporary Western societies were examined over 3 decades ago in his book, The Denial of Death. Becker argued in that book that the anxiety and even terror that we experience in the face of our own fundamental vulnerability and mortality is the foundational experience around which we construct ourselves and our societies. Underlying our fear of vulnerability and powerlessness, he argues, is a denial of death, mortality. For death is the ultimate experience of vulnerability and powerlessness, and one which we will all share. Or we can all agree in general that we're all going to die, of course. Theoretically, we understand. The question is, am I able to confront my death? This need to repress our own mortality, and thus our own ultimate powerlessness, is what drives us to construct personal identities, social institutions, ideologies, and belief systems that can make us feel invulnerable and invincible. Becker argues that the corollary of our obsessive need to feel invulnerable in the face of our common mortality is the need to avoid all pain, all suffering, for these always appear in our lives as unwanted reminders that we're not in control of our own lives, that we're indeed vulnerable. If death is the ultimate enemy, the ultimate threat to our sense of security and invulnerability, so too are all those partial deaths that foreshadow our common end. Illness, old age, poverty, failure, abandonment, pain of any kind. It's not just death itself we fear, but those many daily experiences that cause us anxiety, stress, and pain precisely because they threaten our control of our lives. So these experiences must be avoided at all costs. Indeed, our consumer culture is driven by the promise that all these forms of human vulnerability are avoidable. If only we have the right kind of insurance, the right job, the most impressive resume, the most Facebook likes or Twitter followers. Likewise, authentic human relationships of mutual love and trust are to be shunned, since these always involve a dimension of vulnerability and even pain in the face of another who, however much we may seek to control them, always remains beyond our control. If one falls in love, he or she might get burned. So we surround ourselves with things which, advertisers assure us, will provide the security and invulnerability we crave. And we flee from flesh and blood persons, since these will always demand vulnerability and hence the possibility of pain. We treat people like objects and objects like people. We fall in love with our cars, houses, cell phones, and computers, even as we remain unattached to human persons. But not just any persons, weak, vulnerable persons in particular, wounded persons. For it's these who are especially threatening to our sense of invulnerability. What I feared about that homeless man who confronted me on a street corner was simply the fact that he was there, the fact that he confronted me, and in doing so forced me to recognize my connection to him and to his predicament. And that was terrifying. His very presence forced me to look at myself, my true self. The very existence of the wounded in our midst is so terrifying that we must eradicate them, or at least hide them from view, get them off the streets, lock them up, so we don't have to see them and their uncomfortable wounds. So, argues Becker, the violence inflicted on the weak among us is simply the social face of our denial of our own ultimate powerlessness. If we deny death, we inflict it. But we also inflict it on ourselves. The fear of pain and vulnerability that causes us to shun real human relationships, to shun a true love that always involves surrender and vulnerability in the face of another, ultimately kills our interior life, our ability to feel anything, either pain or joy or love. For, as psychologists remind us, if we repress painful feelings out of fear, we will instinctively also repress any positive feelings. We cannot pick and choose which feelings to repress. To repress feelings of insecurity or pain is to make joy and love impossible. We will then succumb to every kind of addiction and crave any kind of anesthetic that will make us numb to our interior life so that we don't have to feel anything. How often have we heard people boast, "I was so drunk I could feel nothing." Much better to feel nothing than to feel pain. Thus, the true enemy of life is not death, but apathy, or the inability to feel. Death is inevitably a part of life, but apathy is the denial of both. The person who fears death is already dead. The Jesuit peace activist Daniel Berrigan used to pray, "Lord, help me to live so that I die only once at the end of my life." The result of this pathological fear of our own fragility as mortal human beings is the despair and hopelessness that lie just beneath the surface of our most successful communities and families. To scratch that well-manicured surface is to discover the silent desperation that manifests itself in a myriad of self-destructive ways, from chronic depression to every conceivable form of addiction, to destroyed and destructive relationships, to suicide itself, which is simply the literal expression of the internal emotional suicide we've already committed when we wall ourselves off from others and therefore from ourselves. Thus, the suicide rate among suburban white males, the highest for any demographic group, is simply the corollary of the murder rate among inner-city African American and Latino males. The former is a direct result of our failure to confront the latter. Conversely, the act of solidarity with the wounded other is at the same time an acknowledgement of our common woundedness, our common powerlessness. It's also an acknowledgement of our complicity in the infliction of those wounds. And that's why we tragically continue to erect physical and emotional barriers between ourselves and them, so that we will not have to face them and thus face ourselves. So we avoid touching or even seeing the wounds. We avoid risking the act of solidarity or companionship with the victims of history. In Pope Francis's words, we avoid any encounter with the other. Yet once in a while, the apparent peace of this environment is shattered. Once in a while, one of the very people we spend our lives avoiding dares to breach the emotional and geographical barriers we've set up, erupting into our world and disrupting our supposed security. The crucified victim, whom we had abandoned out of fear for our lives, erupts into the upper room and instead of condemning us says, "Peace be with you." Or the homeless man extends his arms to bless and thank me, breaking through the thick wall of fear I had erected to protect me emotionally from him. And what about that nurse in Chicago? What did I learn from her? I learned to look deep into my own heart, my own life, and my own community, to see whether below the placid surface some of us might not be leading what Henry David Thoreau famously called lives of quiet desperation. Behind those clean white picket fences, one may indeed find loving, happy families and communities, but maybe if we look carefully enough, if we scratch the well-scrubbed surface, we'll also find families bereft of mutual love and respect, broken relationships, addictions, and violence. More importantly, that nurse taught me to ask the question, is there a relationship, a connection, between the overt violence of our inner cities and the much less obvious, though equally destructive, violence of our most well-to-do communities? Maybe, just maybe, the fear of vulnerability that has driven us into communities isolated from the people on the other side of the tracks or the other side of the border has had unintended consequences. Maybe that same fear of vulnerability ultimately isolates us from the persons closest to us and even isolates us from our very selves. And this implies that in the end, our own happiness is itself beyond our control, whatever advertisers and marketers may try to tell us. Happiness is not a thing that we can grasp and possess. Those who think it is will spend their lives in anxiety and fear, anxiety until they attain happiness, and were they ever to attain what they think is happiness, fear lest they lose it. Happiness can be neither sought nor bought. This belief is at the heart of Christ's message. For whoever desires to save his or her life will lose it, and whoever loses his or her life for my sake will find it. Christ does not call us to pursue happiness, but to love our neighbor, i.e., to risk vulnerability, to reach across the many borders and barriers we've erected to separate us from them. If we dare to breach the borders that divide us, we might discover the real secret of happiness, namely that happiness is not a goal to be achieved, but a gift to be received. And like any true gift, we're not in control of who offers it or when they offer it. So the more obsessively we pursue our own happiness, and the more tightly we grasp onto our own idea of what constitutes happiness, the more closed we will become to the unexpected kiss on the forehead that breaks through our protective barriers as if from another world. For very often the persons bearing that gift are precisely the poor, the strangers, the weak, the powerless. In other words, precisely those persons whom we expect to be the most depressed and unhappy. And so in our frenzied pursuit of happiness, we avoid them. In the end, our preferential option for the poor, then, is but the acknowledgement of our common contingency, our common dependence on a God whose mercy transcends all our limits and expectations. This is what the bishops at the Second Vatican Council meant when they called the poor God's privileged ones. When one chooses to stand alongside the poor, one will certainly discover that many, many poor persons lead extraordinary, inspiring lives of deep faith and invincible courage in the face of unimaginable hardships. But the poor are privileged not because they're necessarily good, but because God is good. They're privileged because they are the witnesses to a God whose love knows no borders, no boundaries, no barriers, no prison bars. They're privileged because the liberation of the poor is the precondition for our own liberation, and indeed the precondition for God's own liberation from our fearful clutches. The poor are privileged because they remind us that the enemy of faith is not atheism, but fear. To be liberated from our own fear, we must risk embracing those vulnerable persons who are the victims of our fear and self-hatred. To be human is to kneel before our common Creator and therein discover our true happiness and freedom. This is the freedom of those who have nothing to lose because they know and can thank God that their lives are not in their own hands. So they are free to risk vulnerability in love of neighbor. Cardinal Joseph Tobin recently observed, quote, "What topples evil empires is the little person who goes into the square in the middle of town in the dark of the night and scrawls on the wall, 'No.' And I want to say to you," Tobin continued, "we are the no that God scrawls on the wall. We are the no to a nation who is heartless, who would deport people, separating them from their families and their loved ones simply because they are victims of a broken system," unquote. And we are free to scrawl no on that wall only when we are assured that behind every no there pulses an even more powerful, more invincible yes. The yes of the crucified and risen Christ, who breaks through the walls of our fears and says to each one of us, "Peace be with you." We are free to say no to our fear and its violent consequences because we know that the true God has said yes to us, to all of us, in our very vulnerability, because of our very vulnerability. Because God embraces the poor, the sick, and the suffering first, God embraces us all. Thank you.
Questions, but first, don't forget, if you are going to leave in the next few minutes, fill out your assessment cards. We'd love to have this information. We take it very seriously, and we'd love to have your emails, if we don't have those, to tell you about some more talks like we had tonight. Just a quick point on the questions you ask. Remember, no filibustering. You get 3 or 4 sentences, or maybe 5, but don't. Because we want to get through as many questions as possible, I would just ask you to try to keep your comments short and get to your question as soon as possible so we get to as many questions as possible. And I will, as Carl, I'll stop you if you have you have a question though?
Yeah.
Okay.
Is this written someplace? Yes. This came at us pretty fast and
Yes.
I'd like to absorb a little bit.
Yes, this is taken, or some of it, it's kind of put together from various sections of my last book. So some of this is in there.
Which one was that?
That was Christ Our Companion, Theological Aesthetics of Liberation.
And we will also, we're videotaping this as well, so you'll have a chance to, watch this as many times as you would like on the Aquinas Center YouTube channel. Make a little plug. Where we keep a lot of our videos. Yes, sir.
I don't know if this is way off base, but I'm really bothers me is your last statement about people taking their own lives.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been through extensive therapies myself, but
Yeah.
this new generation of soldiers coming back
Yeah.
from our Middle East,
Yeah.
22 a day committing suicides. And I don't understand that being a Vietnam veteran.
Yeah.
Difference in upbringing or whatever,
Yeah.
and then being
Well, I mean, I think it seems to me, just off the top of my head, that a fundamental question to ask is why they're fighting in the first place, and why we have those wars in the first place, and what drives that. But I think one of the challenges that we have in this society, and maybe in all societies, but especially ours, I think, is in trying to make connections across what appear to be separate experiences. The experience of a returning veteran who commits suicide. Might there be a connection between that and and our, whatever, our consumer lifestyle or what is going on in our society? Or are they completely, is this simply an individualistic or personal? I mean, our tendency is to always see problems in terms of individuals. You know, this individual has this problem, rather than to understand persons as necessarily connected to everyone around them, so that we're all products of our relationships and products of our society and the structures in which we participate, and how do those, and through those structures, we influence and inform each other's lives in ways we're not even aware. Pope John XXIII wrote about this in his encyclical, I think it was Mater et Magistra, where he talked about the contemporary society being socialized, and he got a lot of flack for that because people thought he was promoting socialism, but he wasn't. What he was simply saying is that there's no such thing as autonomous individuals, that we're all social beings, which means that what I do informs and impacts, you know, people on the other side of society and on the other side of the world. You know, what I purchase has an impact and influence in the lives of people, you know, of workers in Guatemala or wherever who help make this clothes, so that we all participate in social structures, and therefore how we live influences and informs others. So in terms of, you know, your original question, I would ask, you know, let's go back and see this more as simply, you know, this tragic situation of this individual who was not able to cope with the horrific circumstances that he's dealing with, and ask about, well, what are the reasons for those horrific circumstances to begin with, and why, you know, why are we fighting wars to begin with, and what does that have to do with our own insecurities and our own fears and our own inability to deal with insecurity. I mean, that's just off the top of my head, you know, a reflection I would have on that. Yeah. Sure. Go
I
ahead.
know 4 people who committed suicide. And their families and friends characterize it as based in loss of hope.
Right.
They have financial difficulties, you see no way out.
Right.
Marital difficulties, you see no way out.
Right.
So, disease.
Right. Well, of course, there's disease is also, you know, something that it's take very seriously. There are many cases, depression, for example, that are physiological. So it's not just social. I'm simply suggesting that there's a social component to that. Lost hope. When we lose hope, it begs the question: what was I hoping for, and how do I identify hope? And you know, if I lose hope because I've lost my job or I've lost all financial security, then I think another question is, why did I place my hope there? And I think that's part of the problem that I'm trying to get at here, is that we have been kind of formed and programmed to think that our own freedom, our own liberation, our own hope rests in certain things, and that when we lose these things, having to do with control over our lives, then therefore we've lost hope. Whereas what I'm trying to suggest is that the Christian message is that our only hope can be in God, and that everything else, nothing else, we cannot place our hope in anything or anyone else ultimately, which is very liberating ultimately, because it means that you've got nothing to lose, literally. Whatever you have, you can lose, and you've always got God. Which is why, paradoxically, and I hear this all the time from students who work on the border, or who work in in the inner city, or who work in immersion trips to Latin America, who say, poor people are so happy, first of all, I hate that statement because it can be used in so many kind of destructive ways. But the fact of the matter is that so often people's faith is renewed and renovated precisely by their contact with the poor. I told at the luncheon this morning the story of Raul Julia. Some of you may remember him. He was a Puerto Rican actor who played the part of Archbishop Oscar Romero in the film Romero, on the life of Romero. And Julia, who died tragically not that long after he made the film, talked about his own relationship with his faith as a Catholic. He grew up Catholic in a Puerto Rican household and left the Catholic Church, stopped practicing, and then did this film, the movie, which was filmed in Mexico. And when he was in Mexico, he participated in the faith life of the Catholic communities there, and he said that seeing the faith of the poor is what revived in him his own Christian faith. So in a very practical way, and certainly that's been my experience, what has in many times kept my own faith alive has been precisely working in communities where you see the vitality of a faith that is liberating, precisely because people know that their lives are not in their own hands, and therefore they have nothing to lose. To love, to risk, to be vulnerable, to work for justice, to enter in solidarity, to organize, to write, to scrawl no on the wall. It's when we are assured that we are loved, and when we know that, and we know that nothing can take that from us, that we are then free to be able to take these kinds of risks and to risk the possibility of even imprisonment or, in the case of Christian martyrs, even death. Yeah.
Comments to this question earlier made me think of an editorial that appeared Saturday before last in the Wall Street Journal by a woman by the name of Peggy Noonan, who writes
Yeah.
editorials pretty regularly. She was also a speechwriter during Ronald Reagan's administration. Anyway, she basically is saying that right after the shootings in Florida, why does our society encourage or permit this kind of thing to happen? And she goes on to say that we're in the U.S. we don't value life like we used to, or like we should, and like other countries do. And that this encourages suicide, it encourages people to shoot innocent people and so forth. And she talked about abortion and how legalizing abortion is legalized this
Right.
thinking. So anyway, I thought it was a very good article that ties right into some of the things you're saying. Also, she was talking about taking God out of schools.
Well, I mean, how do we define life? I mean, I think that's a fundamental question. And again, I think I think the gospel has a very specific kind of definition of what constitutes life, and it's not life as the opposite of death or life as, security and control. But it's life as love, as loving, as relationship, as bonds with others and with God. Ultimately, life is defined by is defined by one being loved and one loving, and that's what it's why life can go on even in the face of death. That's why, that even in the face of physical death, the bonds of love can continue beyond physical life. I think the real death, or the ultimate form of death, is abandonment, is isolation. And if what it means to be a human being is to be loved and to love, then death is really defined by isolation, by being. I find it ironic that in the United States, that what we hold up as the model, the great model of what it means to be a fully realized human being, is the autonomous individual, the self-made man, quote unquote, and woman. You don't need anybody. You make it on your own. And yet, if you think about that in terms of the gospel, that's the exact opposite of life, of what it means to be a human being. In fact, I would argue that that's a pretty good definition of hell. Hell is comprised autonomous individuals who don't need anyone. And Jesus, so in Jesus' own resurrection, part of that resurrection was returning to the apostles and reconstituting the community that had been torn asunder on Calvary. It's not just the resurrection of the individual autonomous ego, Jesus Christ, it is the resurrection of the bonds that helped to shape and form him, the bonds of friendship with his disciples and with his community that get reconstituted in the upper room. It's also why I think in the Catholic Church we place so much emphasis on saints and on Mary particularly. That is, if Jesus is not just an autonomous individual, but is the center of a community, the head of a community, then in order to know Jesus, we also have to know his friends, and his mother especially, but his family, his friends, and so it's a way to understand Jesus. There's a funny story told by a friend of mine who's a Mexican-American priest in San Antonio, Texas, and he said that after the Second Vatican Council, some of you may remember, I think, after the Second Vatican Council, a lot of churches took out a lot of the statues of saints, and so they left usually a cross or a crucifix behind the altar, and maybe at most a statue of Mary on the side, and all the other statues were taken out, and the church architecture was simplified. And this priest said that after his church had been renovated, he says he was standing outside after Mass, and this old lady comes to him weeping, crying. And he asks her, Senora Maria, whatever her name was, why are you crying? And she says, this church, she says, I know that Jesus is the most important one, but why does he have to be alone? Yeah.
This recent encyclical or writings in Laudato Si, Pope Francis often commented on the efficiency of capitalism as just a market strategy for reducing poverty overall.
Uh-huh.
And yet, take the United States, for example, we still have a decent number, at least a couple million people in poverty, I think. So I guess my question is, in light of that context, and in light of this concept of the preferential option for the poor, what would a society like, how does a society like, even just take our country like America, act in such a way where we already have these systems like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, et cetera, to help the poor?
Yeah.
But how does a nation like this move more, even closer practically towards really living out a culture?
Well, that's a great question. That's a $64,000 question, isn't it? It's very hard to get at that. And for,
In about 60 seconds.
yeah, there's no system that by definition almost no system that is able to kind of promote a preferential option for the poor is a principle kind of functioning, because every system is going to have marginalized people, it's going to have poor people, and to a certain extent depends on having marginalized and poor people. What I would say is simply, is that the preferential option for the poor in terms of public policy simply means asking, the first question you ask whenever you're debating public policies, how is this going to affect the poor? That's not a secondary question. It's not something that you think about, afterwards. But it's the first question that you always ask, and that that can happen in any kind of system, of economic system. It's how do we and I think I'm actually somebody who thinks that free enterprise is one way of making a preferential option for the poor, if it's contextualized and understood in a particular way. That is that free markets are one way of promoting and wealth and generating wealth, but the free markets themselves don't have the ability to ask the why question. What's the end of this? And that's where, at least in Catholic social teaching, you're dependent upon other forces, community, church, school, et cetera, ultimately the state in the last resort, to kind of to ameliorate the consequences of free market. But again, I think the first question is, how are the poor going to be affected by this? Yeah.
It seems to me that, I mean, the definition of poor, we seem to be concentrating on physical.
Right. Right.
Per capita income.
Yeah.
It seems to me in a secular society like the one and so forth, that poverty should be defined in a much more.
Yeah. That's why I like, you know.
We all are, I certainly know people, I'm sure everybody does,
Yeah.
who have lots and lots of money, but in terms of isolated,
Yeah.
unhappy,
Yeah.
you know, people, it might be them, and they need to be evangelized. But physical poverty in the world is declining at a tremendous rate.
Yeah.
And, I mean, just the explosion in China itself, like quintupling of income in the last
Right.
20 years is just amazing. Billion people.
Right.
So, I mean, the number of people dying of starvation in the world
Yeah.
has shrunk dramatically.
Yeah.
So from a physical standpoint, you know, there's a lot higher per capita income by far than ever
Right.
in the world. But there's tremendous poverty when you look
Right.
around at relationships and what you see on television.
Yeah.
And what we think of as
Mhm.
happiness, cosmetic things we see, like you were saying about the marketing of the products, is so tinny feeling compared to what real, the things you're talking
Right.
about.
Yeah, that's
Relationships and so
right.
forth, and not isolation. So I think we're defining it a little too narrowly when we talk about just the poor man that taught at Yale. That
Right.
touched you. That kind of poverty, that we always run into now people that are
Right.
that way who have lots of money.
Yeah, a couple of points on that. You're absolutely right, of course. And that's why I like Sobrino's definition of the poor as those who cannot take life for granted. And it can be all sorts of reasons why you can't take life for granted, not just not having enough material possessions. Everything from an unborn, child to an elderly person who is isolated and abandoned. And also, the second point that I wanted to make is that Pope Paul VI, in his encyclical Populorum Progressi on the development of peoples, developed this extensively, the relationship between the material poverty of what he called the South, global South, and the spiritual poverty of the global North, and that there's a direct connection between the two, which is kind of what I'm trying to get at here, as in terms of, say, that example of the nurse and the connection between, suicide in wealthy suburbs and direct violence in inner city poverty-stricken neighborhoods, so that it's in everyone's, the liberation of the poor is in everyone's interest, including our own. That, to me, that's the greatest challenge with my students, teaching over the decades, is to help them to make connections among aspects of their lives that they don't see as connected at all, and that we're really often encouraged not to see them as connected of our society. What are the connections between my own suffering and the suffering of others? The first step there is to recognize my own suffering as indeed suffering, as you were saying. If we live in a world where we're taught that if you have this house and this car and all this wealth and everything, you must be happy, then your first challenge will be to acknowledge that you're not happy. Because you start thinking, well, I must be crazy. Everybody wants to be like me. It's kind of like, I think I read somewhere, I don't know if it's accurate, but it makes sense, that the highest suicide rate in the United States is in San Francisco. It makes sense to me. You're living in an idyllic, most beautiful, city in the world. Every time I go to San Francisco, people always ask me, when are you moving here? When are you moving here? I'm not planning to move, I'm perfectly content in Boston, despite the winters. But if you're constantly getting the message, you ought to be happy, and you're not, then that disconnect inevitably winds up destroying you in one way or another. And I see it among students all the time who think they ought to be walking around smiling all the time when they're being torn up inside for whatever reason. And they think then they begin to think, well, there must be something wrong with me. Which is why Thomas Merton used to say, you know, if we live in a neurotic society, it's the neurotic person who's really most in touch with reality. It's those of us who are well-adjusted are the ones who are really in trouble. You know?
I think here and then you got over here, maybe.
What do you think about the church enabling this administration, enabling as a clinical
Mm-hmm.
condition? Enablers even come to assume the guilt of
Mhm.
our
Wow. What can I say? I mean, I was just reading an article the other day, making that argument. I mean, I think Christians and all religious people we have to do some real soul searching in the contemporary context to see, to what extent are we participating and allowing ourselves to be complicit in what is going on in this society. And to a great extent, as the quote from Cardinal Tobin suggests, I think our ability to do that is dependent upon our ability to ourselves be free enough and be secure enough in our own understanding of ourselves as loved by God, that we are able to risk speaking out or confronting the injustices that we see perpetrated around us. And it can happen in all sorts of ways, small and large. How do we deal with students in our colleges and classrooms? Do we pretend that what is happening is not happening, or do we talk about it and allow them to talk about it and to address the question, how do I live in this kind of society? I remember I had a Korean American student who said, I've always thought of myself as an American until now. Now I see myself as Korean. I had never seen myself as other before. So and how do we accompany, and that's another term that Pope Francis has used a lot, people who are being excluded and who are being ostracized and who are being, to use an academic term, othered, because it's a person who is other is always made an other by those of us who are in the center or who are in power. Until you tell them, you are not us, they see themselves as simply regular human beings, right? Just as my student saw herself as an American until she was told, no, you're not an American, you're Korean. And so do we remain silent and therefore complicit? Do we remain neutral in this situation and therefore complicit? Or do we speak up? There are individuals, I think, who have begun to speak up. But the church as a whole still, I think, has some way to go before we as a church, and by the church I mean all of us, really are able to confront the reality that we're facing.
Thank you so much. I thought it was a great talk and lecture. I'm not sure if I'm going to agree with the definition for the poor, but I do think it's quite compelling.
Mm-hmm.
And but I just I hear a lot about the poor as evangelizers. I think that came across pretty liberation of the poor, to be specific, how liberating the poor actually leads to our salvation. And I guess and then to just add into that, I think part of my problem is I do think material poverty matters. And so
Sure.
And deeply, and that, and that it's only through material poverty that you have a privileged perspective to see how. So as much as I appreciated the move towards the suicide, I'm not sure that.
No, I would agree with you that what I would agree with is that all forms of poverty have a necessary material dimension. That is, a poor Latino is very different from a wealthy Latino, right? Or in my case, even a poor white is very different from a wealthy white. So that all differences, I would argue, and all forms of marginalization are mediated economically. A woman is marginalized by virtue of the fact that she's a woman in our society, in a patriarchal society. But a poor woman, an African American woman, is marginalized in a very different way than a middle class white woman. So I take your point.
I just wonder how the liberation of the poor, because that was mentioned before.
Well, because
is salvation itself.
right, I guess my point is that if we believe in a God who is transcendent, who transcends all of our human preconceptions, prejudices, constructs, who is really mystery with a capital M, and who therefore is out of place in this world, then that God is going to be encountered by us. We will encounter that God in those places and among those people who themselves are out of place in this world. Right? Okay, so if to be saved means to come to know God, to encounter, to enter into relationship with, to become one with God, we cannot do that abstractly in history unless and until we are able to encounter that God as that God is revealed in those people who are out of place in our world.
But encounter, in that sense, surely has to also mean identification with and even becoming.
Oh, sure.
When I'm taking, from what you said,
Sure.
lots of different things that I've read, including a wonderful little classic, Johannes Metz's Poverty of Spirit,
Yeah.
where he underlines the necessity of our identification with poverty in the sense that Jesus accepted his humanity. We have to first accept our humanity. So the whole question for me is, how do I identify, how do I become the poor person
Right.
who will be saved? And I don't mean that in a
Yeah.
metaphorical sense.
Yeah.
Francis of Assisi did it
Right.
literally.
Right.
Dorothy Day did it literally.
Right.
So that's way beyond me, but you know,
Yeah, no, I agree. And encounter I only mean as a first step, but ultimately solidarity and becoming one with, while at the same time recognizing that I'm never going to be poor. I mean, that there's also a certain humility that we have to have, because if nothing else, I have my education, which always makes me non-poor. I can always get out of poverty if I wanted to. But yes, to be able ultimately to identify with, and I guess what I'm saying here is that one way we do that is by recognizing our common vulnerability, that in the end, we're both going to end up in the same place, and that if I don't recognize that in my own life, and therefore learn from you, and become one with you in your own vulnerability, then I will wind up doing violence both to you and to myself. But yes, ultimately it is the goal is union, is becoming one with, both with God and with others.
We'll take, sorry, we got one more question. Sorry, maybe afterwards. Yes. Frank.
Hey there, good evening. I appreciated how vulnerable you were, but sharing your own encounters that made you comfortable and how these encounters reshifted how you saw those who were poor. As a person who comes from El Salvador, I know just a little bit about what it means to be poor. Just touching how you frame this lecture, like why we should live our lives in such a way that is always considering those who have less. You gave us examples of the nurse and the person who was homeless and kissed you on the head, and it really was touching. The pessimistic part of me, though,
Yeah.
tells me that their actions may be too passive. In some ways, maybe too romantic, at least for some.
Yeah.
But what about those who are about to lose, or about those who have just lost their loved ones? So what about those who are about to lose DACA, or those who have lost their TPS, or those who have loved ones who have committed suicide? So what happens with those who are not as passive or as loving?
Right.
What about those who are protesting and demanding?
Right.
And are out?
Well, this is why I insist that the preferential option for the poor it doesn't say anything about the poor. It's not about the poor. The poor suffer from the same kinds of issues that all human beings suffer. The poor may react to our loving actions in ways that are not loving or that are ungrateful. Again, I've worked with a lot of students who have been involved in service projects and who have gone through all sorts of crises because they say, whoa, here I am serving meals to these people and they don't even say thank you, and so there's, the poor are just like anybody else. So there's always a danger of romanticizing, but the point, I think, is that the preferential option for the poor has nothing to say. It tells us nothing about the poor. It tells us something about God. And if God is a God who loves everyone equally, then that God must love the poor in a special way, not because they're any better than anybody else, but simply because they're poor. Jesus never in the Gospels asks a poor person, tell me why you're poor. Is it just because you can't find work, or are you a deserving poor or an undeserving poor? No, just the very fact of poverty is a claim on us. No questions asked. This is what was amazing about somebody like Dorothy Day in The Catholic Worker. She never asked anybody who walked into a Catholic Worker house why they were there. They simply show up and you work with them. So that's my point. I think there's always a danger of romanticizing, and romanticization is a form of dehumanization, just like any other.
Okay, real quick. This is it. This is my question.
Something I found extremely, and it's small, is when you brought up the issue of the cross.
Right.
And there's religions out there that have crosses, plain crosses without Jesus.
Right.
And there's others that will not let a cross, Christian churches, in their church. And I found it quite interesting because I've always wondered about that. And I thought that was quite significant if you really ponder that deeply. That a cross represents evilness.
That cross represents
Evil.
Yeah, right, exactly. Which is why.
Himself alone
Yeah.
is good.
Which is why, as a Catholic, I like having Jesus hanging from the cross.
It's even hanging from the cross.
Yeah.
Associating with, you have to really think about it. I've often, you hit a point I never thought about.
Yeah. Okay.
All right, so I'm going to thank our guests. Thank you very much. Thank you.